one. So panel, it's important in today's debate in the spirit of recognition to understand what social expenditure means in this particular context. Okay, so we think that from opening governments, when you're talking about social spending, we are looking at direct investments that really benefits the lives of the people directly. So it could be in form of specific infrastructure, social amenity that directly target livelihoods of people. It could be empowerment programs that really uplift the standards of living of people. We think that it could even be some kinds of support like educational support and all of those things that particularly develop the personhood of these particular people in this state. And that's important to recognize in today's debate. But secondly, on the matter of indebtedness, we think indebted countries in this debate does not necessarily mean very poor, impoverished countries with no infrastructure at all there is in that particular regard. We think that we can have variable context. We think, for example, countries, developed countries, like countries with reasonable infrastructure, like Greece, for instance, is indebted, but not very poor, does not have lack all the infrastructure and all of those things and all of that. So that particular context is really important. And that means that this debate is much more open than expected. But even in the particular context of indebted countries coupled with underdevelopment and poverty and all of those things, we think that most of the times it is because the poor infrastructural developments that exist there leads to a shambolic economy, most often than not because there is no adequate investment into the lives and development of the people. Is going to lead to joblessness and hence the inability of the state to generate enough taxes, and then a system of perennial borrowing. And that's also important to note in this debate. So the comparative, the ultimate comparative in today's debate is an epistemic consideration of whether countries should focus on regenerating capacity to advance their development in order to pay off these loans or debts systematically, or they should focus aggressively in settling the debt stock without focus on any sustainable frameworks to support the economy thereof. Today's debate is not about whether they should pay the loans or not pay the loans. From opening governments, we are quick to say that prioritization of social spending does not mean a neglect to paying of the loans. They will ultimately pay the loan, but should that be their primary focus? Should they aggressively do that in lieu of any other business of the state, like social spending? We think that if they have a proportion, they should more aggressively focus on social spending as opposed to the settling of those debt stock. We think this is important because fundamentally we think a stable system, a stable economy in itself puts these countries in the right fundamentals to be able to settle this debt. We think that in servicing debt stock and growing and developing as a nation, it's important to focus more on sustainable frameworks and not things that momentarily would be interesting to do, but then practically would not give any form of sustainability to the state in that particular regard. Before I move on, I'll take anybody who have a POI. Okay. So another thing to understand, yeah, you can go ahead.
Sorry about that. I just, to the extent that you're able to spend money on both things, I feel like we could also reasonably feel out having some degree of social programs. And if something pays off immediately, I feel like reasonably that could be part of prioritizing loan repayment. If it makes it easier to repay loans, reasonably there should be a trade-off between one and the other.
Come again, please.
Like, if it's true that a specific social program will immediately increase your economic well-being and make it easier to pay off loans, that isn't actually a trade-off. That thing is just helping you with your underlying goal of paying off loans. It probably doesn't make things very comparative.
I don't think your POI is very clear, but if I understand you, you are asking about whether these particular investments are ones that can particularly help immediately in paying off the loans. We don't think that it should necessarily immediate, as in the fastest short possible time, like in less than a year or something. But we think that what we do know in this particular debate is that adequately investing in the lives of your people, adequately empowering your people is the major drive that you need for economic transformation. And we think that that ripple effect, that translational effect, is something that's always going to be evident, because there is a direct correlation between the ability of the people who are empowered through social spending to be able to contribute to the economy, and that there is a direct correlation between a good economy and the ability to service loans in all of these instances progressively. What we do not want is that particular prioritization of the servicing of loans ahead of that development of the people and the generation of the capacity for the people to be able to contribute to the economy. That's a direct distinction that you need to pay attention to. But it's also important to notice that most of these debt stock, most of the times, are very historical, okay? So it means that sometimes the nature of these states might have even changed and all of those things. As a matter of principle, we think that if current generation are supposed to make a choice in what approach they should use, I don't think a complete prioritization of servicing of the debts that has been accrued historically in of itself is something that should be prioritized ahead of their substantive livelihood in that particular regard. Well, you can argue to an extent that they have an obligation, intergenerational obligation of itself, but I do not think that that overrides the ability to sustain themselves in the interim. Yeah?
Can I stop you for a sec? Sorry. There appears to be a misconnection from opening opposition. I've just noticed in the chat. I've stopped the timer. I've written also where had you stopped. Just checking with opening opposition. Is the member that was disconnected reconnected already?
Yes, it was the leader of. Okay, it was the leader of opposition.
I was stuck in the breakout room, and I missed half of his speech. So we'll have to then swap. Pule will speak first because I didn't hear most of his speech.
All right. So do both OO speakers feel all right with you just switching the order of speakers?
Yes, we agree.
All right, so just checking. It means Pule will speak first and Siyanda will speak second?
Yes, that's correct.
All right. Micheal, I have stopped you about 1 minute and 15 seconds before the end of your speech. You were just saying that if we don't adequately invest in the economy, then we are not going to be able to grow it in the long run in response to the POI that you have received not much earlier than that. Do you recall pretty much where you stopped?
I have a question.
Yeah.
So you said 1 minute 15 seconds to the end of the speech.
Yes.
I have it as 1 minute 45. Maybe.
According to the timer that I've set, it was 1 minute 15 seconds before the end of the speech. In any case, I am happy to give extra like 10 seconds or so to make up for the, abruptness in the speech. But we can also.
My bad. I think that's fine.
Yeah, I've had you stop at 5:45. That's the thing. So, do you recall where it was? It was in the response to the POI. You started to answer that this is the direct result of not adequately investing in the economy that led to the debt, etc. Do you recall where it was?
Yeah.
All right. I'm going to give you like 1.5 minutes to make sure that you can get on track back, right?
All right.
So whenever you're ready. Sorry about that.
All right. So the biggest issue in this debate is the ability of these states to be able to regenerate capacity such that investing in their people to allow them to meaningfully join the contribution to the economy. It is in this that they can be able to industrialize more, they can be able to pay more taxes, and that's the state having the capacity to be able to do this. But more importantly, what should be noted is that most of these debt stocks are very historical. We don't think that in the interim, current generation should prioritize settling these debts over their own future and over their own substantive livelihood in that particular regard. Well, you can make an argument to an extent that there is an intergenerational justice and responsibility for them to do that. But we don't think that overrides their primary survival and livelihood, and that is important. We think that what's the goal of today's debate is the ultimate transformation of these particular states, these particular countries they need to develop, okay? So we think that there's a correlation between the ability to service the debt and the paying of the debt. The comparative, once again, in this debate is that you focus on servicing the debt right now ahead of your sustainable project of development. That's in turn will give you the capacity to service these debts in that particular regard. We think that in investing in social spending, you are more likely to strengthen institutions. There is a huge correlation between strong institutions and your ability to transform the economy in all sectors: political, economic, social, and all of those things. Economic structure in itself should be more organic and very sustainable. We think that adequately investing in the grassroots, investing in social spending, is a more organic and sustainable structure that you can have for economy in this particular regard. We think a prioritization of this stable economic structure build up on a more solid framework is more likely to sustain these countries on the drive for transformation, and that is particularly important to avoid issues like brain drain and capital flight in that particular regard. Thank you.
I'd like to thank the previous speaker for a very fine speech. Quick checkup that my panel is also ready.
Good.
Yes, I'm good to go.
Then I'm very happy to call upon the leader of opposition. Here.
Am I audible? Okay, I'll take a point of information from closing government for engagement purposes, and I'll start in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, go. Chair, recognize a few points of contextual clarity. Social spending, as much as opening government would like to tell us, is direct investment to the lives of the people, exists on a spectrum. It's not only about the empowerment of people and educational support. It could be things like social welfare for individuals who are disabled, things like spending for the elderly, things like spending on child support. All these things are arbitrarily social spending that is directly engaged in terms of the empowerment of individuals. But at best, these are not only used in terms of just the upliftment of society and getting more individuals participating in the economy. Sometimes these are created to uplift individuals in terms of reparations and redress some forms of harms that those individuals face. This contextual clarity is important for two reasons. The first one is that social spending does not only trickle down to empowering individuals to be part of the global community in terms of engaging in things like tax, but secondly, social spending does not only trickle down in terms of only large institutions which people can pay back. Notice also the second contextual clarity is that paying back loans are not only historical. In most instances, the reason why nations take loans presently is for three things. The first one is for need for development. So a specific sector of the government needs to develop a certain facet of it. For example, they need to uplift and upgrade things like water development or the acquisition of water, things like food security, things like huge state spending in terms of social welfare, as I've already said. But lastly, they take up loans, specifically for large nations. They take up loans to boost infrastructure outside of the capital states get from tax. For example, states get a huge amount of money from tax, and they're arbitrarily going to funnel that out into specific facets of governments, things like the increase of infrastructure, allowing for huge developments in terms of housing in those developed nations. That's absolutely very important in terms of this debate. I'll take closing at 5 minutes. I noted your POI. Secondly, we think that opening government does a very disservice to this motion. They say that debt stocks are historical and should be considered outside of the debate. Particularly, it's very important to note that this motion requires them to prioritize social spending over paying back loans. They can concede to the fact that yes, you're going to pay back loans, but at the point at which you need to make that trade-off for prioritization is exclusively very beneficial. On opposition side, we're happy to support the intermingling of both ideas. So you support both of them without prioritizing one over the other. But we think at best you can also argue and say that you need to pay back your loans first before you incentivize things like social spending. We think in most nations, especially in terms of ones that use social spending, they don't need a lot of development in terms of requiring to pay individuals things like social spending a lot, because a lot of these nations have things like educational programs outside of social spending that is arbitrarily linked to the way in which those nations get capital. Things like tax are arbitrarily given to those individuals because they can sustain those livelihoods. But we think at worst, even if we look at the poorer nations in society, all those things are arbitrarily hinged and factored on the fact of nations can get capital from infrastructure that they're unlikely to get from anything else, things like tax, but also getting loans specifically for social spending is arbitrarily linked to the fact that these nations can exclusively get scarce capital from anything else. This is particularly very important contextual clarity that you're going to get from our side. But lastly, they tell us that people are able to get more ability when you incentivize and spend more money on them. So you have more individuals engaging in markets and allowing them to have things like resources and limit the things of capital flight. We think that's absolutely not exclusive to prioritizing social spending, because we think at best in most developing nations, a lot of individuals already have skills and sets that are arbitrarily linked outside of the facet of social spending. So you don't need as much exacerbation of those capital. But we think even at worst, when you developing nations, those societies don't necessarily need social spending to the effect that paying back loans is arbitrarily restrictive on them. I'm going to give you more analysis in my speech. Few key features of my speech. Firstly, I'm going to talk about the relationship of paying back these loans. Secondly, the actual issues that these nations face. But thirdly, in terms of sustainability, because that's something that opening government does not tackle. First, in terms of the relationship to payback, we think at best when you create loans or have loans in society, there's an expectation for you to pay back. And the reason for that expectation to pay back is because at best you're creating a relationship in which you can borrow money in the future when you need it most, or when you want to get things like certain benefits in terms of sustaining social spending. So at best, when nations borrow money, there's an expectation or growing expectation from paying back those loans. One, when you don't pay them back or don't prioritize paying them back, there's a lack of expectation that you give of paying backs. One, either you're incapable of paying back, that means that you're more likely not going to have the same relationship in terms of paying back. That means even if you're likely to borrow money in the future, more likely not going to get the same capital back. That means that you're a higher risk of getting capital than you were before. Secondly, the expectation of paying back is absolutely very important in maintaining the social structure that you have with those instances. But we think at best, if you look at the example that they give you of Greece, Greece was incentivized to only pay the interest accrued by this loan. That means that even developing nations which are relatively smaller, unlike your USA or your China, are arbitrarily incentivized to pay back some interest so that these institutions that borrow them money still have capital to borrow them in the future. Why is this very important analysis in today's debate? Because you recognize that the only way in which social spending often functions is when you have capital that's consistent, so your ability to get money back from these institutions. But we think even if the relationship is broken and degraded, many nations require to get loans or need to pay back loans because those loans make it very difficult for them to have any form of capital to sustain in their country. At best, when you're paying back loans, you have less interest to pay on those loans, one, but also you are likely to have less incentives for you to pay other institutions like those loans. What does this do? Two things. Firstly, it allows for capital safety. So at the best, at point where nations are failing to get things like capital, they're more likely going to get that from that exclusive thing. But secondly, you have two things. First one is the risk that you're likely to accrue. That means you have a higher risk of when you don't pay back loans, but also you don't limit the amount of money that you can borrow at the end. That's why Congo can't borrow a certain feature of money from the IMF, because it was incapable of paying loans in the past. Even when they need them the most, they're incapable of doing so because they were incapable of paying back that loan. I'll take closing.
Yeah, if you spend a large amount of money overseas in the repayment of debt, but you still charge people the tax for it, which you have to do to get the money, that means there's more money going out than coming in, which then means that you will cause a recession, which is what happened in Greece. Is that worth it?
No, we think, particularly from our side, we don't prioritize social spending because at best you don't necessarily reap the same benefits that you guys speak about, or you're likely going to speak about, because we don't think at best educational support and all these features are arbitrarily linked on the ability for people to give out. We think there's a huge capital flight in larger nations because you give them so much incentives to get things like capital at no incentives where the nations get money back from themselves. But even at best, we don't say prioritize only paying back loans. We think at best, we don't necessarily argue that, but we think at equal, when individuals are paying tax and those forms of transactions are arbitrarily very important for the entire social spending anyway. So we think that social spending at some best is important, but we don't think prioritization is absolutely very important. Secondly, in terms of sustainability of social spending and it being premised on capital, three things you're going to get. The first one is that without prioritizing paying back, you can't sustain social spending because it requires some form of capital outside of the tax that you get from people. Secondly, institutions of capital lose capital aid that you're likely to get from these nations. So you create a vacuum of capital not being given to you because you're incapable of paying back that loan anyway. But thirdly, the debt creates some form of dependence. So you force things like collateral to be the consideration of that discussion. One, you harm nations in terms of natural resources. So you say that because you can't pay back loan, give us specific natural resources, or you're likely to sell state-owned enterprises, much like how the Belt and Road Initiative functions. Side with opening opposition because you gave you correct contextualization of what this debate requires, but also how you're more likely going to harm these nations in the future. We win.
I'd like to thank the previous speaker for a very fine speech. Quick check out that my panel is also ready.
I'm ready.
Yeah.
Then I'm very happy to call upon the Deputy Prime Minister. Here.
All right, sure. Can everyone hear me? Can everyone hear me, please?
Yeah, you're audible.
Sure. So I cannot observe the chat space, so feel free to interrupt softly my speech and ask a POI, but preferably start in the 5th minute, right? All right, sure. So I begin in 3, 2, 1. You need to look at a world where we would have to pay back loans, certain actions which the government necessarily needs to take in order to continue paying back those loans. From opening government, we feel that those actions necessarily mean that our ability to pay back loans is limited in the sense that of how we necessarily need to deal with it. Because what should the government do in order to be able to pay back these kind of loans? What they need to do is they need to cut public investments. It means that they need to institute austerity measures, which normally means that there's less employment and there's less economic interaction within the state. This is most likely going to lead into a recession because people's pensions are going to be fucked up. Most companies are going to engage in capital flight and leave those countries, as for example we saw in Greece. This is most likely going to lead to political instability, right? It means that most people are going to resist taxes, are going to engage and are going to resist the state. Most of the time, this also leads to things like violence, or even in the best case of conditions, a change of government, right? A change of government which necessarily will change their priorities. What these things mean is that these countries are now put in a position where they are now credit unworthy. All of the harms which they talk about on their side still happens because the countries are put in a state where no country is willing to be able to offer them loans anymore, because these countries will now be seen as having structural inefficiencies which make them incapable of paying back. So this is not a harm that you can necessarily run away from. This is necessarily how you can be able to turn a bad condition into one that has a comparative benefit, right? Or a net benefit. And that is essentially what we prove on our side, because we do not say that this does not come with certain harms, right? But we are better able to deal with those harms. How? Because the credit worthiness of a nation is dependent on a lot of things. First of all, it's dependent on your ability to pay back. So even if you do not pay back in the short term, countries are still willing to be able to give you loans with special interest when they see that you have a generative capacity within your economy to pay back. And that's essentially why our extension was very important, because we show you why you create robust economies that are able to pay back. But secondly, you still have measures within your means to be able to default on these loans and still keep your credit worthiness. For example, by asking for extensions, as Greece did several times. When you ask for these extensions, they are more likely to be given to you, or you ask that these loans be paid back in good spaces of time. We think all of these things are measures you can use in our world, which will ensure that your credit worthiness does not go down into the ground. This could be rescue measures. They may not be the best of conditions. They may not always work, but this is non-existent in their model, and that's necessarily what you need to recognize. The second thing they say in response is to say that, well, we say that all loans are historical. That is essentially punishing us for us trying to be largely comparative and try to expand the characterization. You should realize that that is the nature of most loans, because it's not like you give us the loan and we necessarily have to pay back immediately. But then our case still deals with current loans where investments are made into other parts of the economy and we still have to pay back. So that is essentially strawmanning of our case. The next thing they say is that social spending does not always result in a payback. All right, but we think that spending on minority groups like the disabled, like women and children, and engaging in livelihood empowerment programs significantly within developing countries is able to have a huge effect on the economy. First of all, even if we are not able to directly tax them, what we do is significantly reduce the dependency ratio in families in the developing countries. What this means is that the amount of money that the heads of these families make is now able to go into other utilities, the ability to be able to pay taxes and free them. It means they're much more able to save and invest their money and be able to recoup that form of investment. So you can't run away from the fact that there's an economic benefit which we gain from this. Significantly reducing the dependency ratio in these families is crucially important. What Mike tells you is that we are able to build strong institutions, legal, political, which means that businesses are now more incentivized to do business. So the ease of doing business is significantly better in our world. Our tax collection systems, our legal systems of redress. What the additional benefits we get is the respect for human rights, because fundamentally things like their health, education are much more taken care of. But necessarily the building of these social amenities correlates to the ability of these businesses to be able to work within the district and improve on the labor capital within the economy. We think that investment is crucial, especially even in the short run. Like even in the short term, we're able to cut that dependency ratio and get all of the benefits which they want. But what's the importance of social spending? We think that these countries have limited capacity in paying back these loans anyway. So even if you want to, the measures taken causes some problems, like the austerity measures, like the limited employment, which necessarily affects the most vulnerable. What this means is that most people who have the skill, and there's massive brain drain, which means most people who have the skill and the labor take flight within most of these communities. If closing as a POI, I'll take it. Within outcome, realize that OO is largely uncomparative on the sustenance of most of these nations, and that's how come like that POI was asked, because how are you able to move forward as a nation when you pay back all of your loans and you are plunged in political instability and debt, and no one still wants to give you loans? We think that trade-off is better when you are able to strengthen the economy, because that means that even if no one gives you any loan after, you are still able to have internal generative capacity. Closing, I'll take you. So in the short term, generally government spending is increased because of one, investor confidence in the economy, but secondly, because of the increased cash flow and access within the economy. So the increased investor confidence means that government shows faith within this economy and is able to drive down inflation by increasing the supply of money. So example, infrastructure development directly then means that contractors, laborers who have to work on these jobs have immediate employment. So I don't get what OO is trying to say. This increased employment means that we are able to generate and reap taxes in this instance. So when you don't do this, what you have is that the people's conditions are sacrificed to pay back those loans, huge unemployment, huge labor loss, capital flight, because the lack of infrastructure means no one is willing to invest in your economies. It means even when corporations do, they are likely not to keep their investments with their interest within those economies. But governments are then coerced to now grant tax savings to these guys. It means that whatever investment you don't have the capacity to be able to withhold and be able to take advantage of investments that comes within your economy. We think on both sides of the house, you have the harms. On which side are you significantly able to deal with the harms, especially in the long term? Vote opening government. Is my time done? Is my time done?
You're on time. You finished at 7:08.
Okay.
I'd like to thank the previous speaker for a very fine speech. Checking that my panel is also ready.
Yeah, I'm ready.
Boemo?
I'm also ready.
Awesome, thanks. Then I'm very
Yes, I'm ready.
I'm very happy to call upon the Deputy Leader of Opposition. Here.
Can you guys hear me now? Okay, I'll be starting in 3, 2, 1. Panel, there's an important understanding that we ought to have, in particular in today's debate, for us to even go further. One, within the characterization, particularly why these nations particularly aren't able to pay back these loans. We think that we miss that kind of contextual clarity and understanding from opening government. So they fall out of this debate, first thing. Two, we think that they don't engage in Pule's particular matter when he tells us, we think that all these benefits they talk about aren't exclusive, particularly to a prioritization of social payments, particularly. So they needed to do their burden in today's debate was to show us why, particularly, we ought to prioritize social spending in comparative to paying back loans, and not just show us why social spending is important. So we tell you that, particularly in Pule's speech, and the leader of opposition tells us that we think that we also value social spending, but we don't value it at a cost, one, where we harm the relationships, particularly within financing institutions. Two, we harm our ability to even attain some sort of financing post whatever hardships that we go through. Three, we aren't able to attain that kind of change that we want to. And Pule gives you some sort of gives you clarity, particularly on social spending, particularly in what it looks like. We think that opening government doesn't do justification, particularly on how we think there's a quite missing link to show us why particularly social spending means there's direct job creation, particularly, and some sort of benefit, particularly, that comes from this. And then Erasmus's speech goes on further and saying, we think that we allow individuals, particularly, to have that ability to create those kind of jobs and infrastructure development. We think there's a missing link to show us why, particularly, we ought to understand that social spending, particularly on those individuals who attain from these social welfare programs, particularly that states create on social spending, aren't sufficient for them, particularly, to create these kind of jobs that he speaks on the kind of spending that he speaks on, that this allows for the driving forces within these markets. We think that we've seen in status quo where states in themselves, particularly, allow for the existence, particularly without the prioritization of within today's debate. We think without the prioritization of social spending, without them, they don't necessarily lose that capital that they speak about. It's an opening government. I'll take a POI at 5. We think that it's very important that you understand that, one, we think these nations, the reasons why they're failing, the actual issue exists. There's a failure of proper economic policies and implementation, particularly within developing nations, to allow for the growth of those economies and the sustainability within those economies. We think they don't engage particularly on that kind of context. We think that it's important that these states have some sort of powerful or stronger economic policies that come into play. Two, we think that at a point where you start prioritizing social spending, you don't recognize the actual issues that exist, particularly within those nations, particularly on why their economies aren't growing or aren't sustainable, particularly, and need these debts in the first place. We think that at a point where you then don't engage, particularly in those failing economic policies, you don't recognize the kind of failures, particularly, that exist and allow for the continuity of those failing policies. So we think that at a point where even if we were in a world where we were to concede with what opening government tells us, we think that these states aren't able to create some sort of ability for them to pay back the loans and do social spending. We think that that's also because on the basis that these economic policies aren't in structure to hold these individuals accountable for the kind of spending that exists. We think that states in themselves misuse funds, particularly. So we think that within these particular nations, we don't necessarily think that it's very valuable kind of how these loans in themselves are put into place. So we necessarily think that Pule gives you particularly the reasons why we think that states already take these kind of loans. 1, for development. 2, infrastructure development. 3, for sustainability of economies, particularly in today's debate. We think these 3 characterizations, particularly that you get from Pule, are very important to understand. And we think that most states who aren't able, and the kind of states that they talk about in opening government are states in themselves that don't necessarily do these things effectively because of failing economic policies. We think that they ought to engage in that kind of arguments from their closing. We think it's important to understand this. They ought to then, in closing, we think that they ought to do this, is show us why particularly these kind of benefits that they talk about are exclusive, particularly to at a point where the states only prioritize the social spending compared to paying back loans. We think that when Erasmus acknowledges that loans ought to be paid back, he values the kind of relationships that exist, particularly within these states, within the funding institutions and these states that need these loans, because at a point says we ought to take states like Greece asking for extensions, particularly to pay these backs. We think that at a point where states in themselves, financing institutions like IMF or World Bank allow for some sort of extension is at a point where they understand and recognize particularly that these states in themselves have some sort of economic policies that are sustainable and they want these the growth particularly within these economies. And we think that this is not exclusive at a point where you prioritize social change, social spending in today's debate. I'll quickly take closing.
Yep. If a country is in a huge amount of debt, then that generally means the amount of debt that they're incurring is so much that they're mostly paying the servicing costs and not paying the underlying principal. If they don't take steps first to grow their economy, it's not that someday they're going to be able to get out of this debt hole. They're probably never going to be able to get out of it. They're perpetually going to be running big surpluses in order to pay back this cost.
Okay. We think that at a point where you're even not paying the principal debt in itself, we think we value that ability for those states to pay that back. We think that financing institutions value that ability for those states to continue paying, which is why they allow those states in themselves to get even more funding to be able to continue their ability to grow those economies. We think that at a point where these states don't value that kind of ability for them to pay back, we think they harm, 1, kind of relationship that exists to their ability to get financing in the long term. We think that even at a point.
Sorry, can I stop there? Yeah, you are starting to sound with a sort of background noise. Could you say a full sentence now? I've stopped the timer.
Can you guys hear me? Or
Yeah, now you're
terrible.
Now you're audible. So I've lost you exactly when the POI finished. When you started answering the POI, this was when you were starting to sound a bit robotic. So I've stopped the timer at 5:45. I will give you 10 extra seconds as well. Could you start again from this point? From answering the POI?
Responding from the POI.
Yeah.
Sorry, please repeat. Responding from the POI, right?
Respond to the POI, yeah. This is where I lost you.
Okay, thank you. I'll be going back in 3, 2, 1. We think that it's important that individuals pay back at a point, even if they're not paying back the principal amounts particularly. We think that's a sign of good faith. We think that that kind of relationship that comes particularly that exists within those instances is one that's valuable. One, it allows for the maintenance particularly and of those relationships. Two, we think that at a point they ought to show us why these states themselves particularly exist in a world where they can't maintain social spending and particularly the ability for these individuals to pay back, even though it's not the principal amount. We value that kind of payment and ability for those states to even show that ability to pay back.
You're starting to break off again. I'm not sure. I'm not sure what causes that because you were audible before. Are you getting closer or farther away from the mic? Is this something that happens?
Okay, let me bring the mic closer to me.
Maybe it will help. Yeah.
Okay. Boemo, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Where did I cut? If you remember.
Yeah. You were just saying that even if we can't pay back everything, it is a sign of good faith, and then you are starting to break off.
Okay. How many minutes are left now? A minute and?
A minute 5.
Okay, thanks. In 3, 2, 1. We think that it's valuable, even if at a point where they pay they're not paying back the principal amount. We think that that kind of contribution is a sign of good faith and ability for you to be a good payer. We think that it allows these institutions to still value the relationship that exists. We think that opening government already concedes that these relationships are very valuable, which is why we also ought to value the relationship and economic growth. We think that the reason also Pule already tells you that we take these loans is still to grow our economy. So we don't think necessarily that economic growth is linked at a point where you don't pay back these loans. We think you rather have the ability to even grow these economies at a point where individuals see there is no need for you. They can't value the relationship with you. So you disincentivize individuals to even want to even exist within those states as investors because one, you don't pay back your sort of loans, so they ought not to value the ability to even be able to invest within those states because we think that that investment in itself isn't one that's valuable. These states ought to see that. We think that what do you get from opening opposition utility? We think that we show you why particularly we think that social spending ought not to be prioritized over paying back. We think that development can exist within these two things. We think that the benefits that come particularly at a point where social spending exists isn't mutually exclusive to when we prioritize social spending over paying back loans. We think that we also value the ability for individuals and states to pay back these loans. We think that at a point even when we recognize and say people after extension, we think these are forms of communication, particularly of paying back these loans. We think that these things aren't necessarily exclusive, particularly to only social spending. We think that these things are valuable. We'll give you 3 reasons why particularly states particularly take into these loans even in the first place, and we value them. We think that even if you can see that these states, these loans in themselves are historic, we think that at a point where you continue using the financing from these historic debts is why we think that you ought to still pay back and you have an obligation to pay these debts back. So we don't necessarily think that just because they're historic debts, you ought to not pay them back. We think that you still ought to pay these states back because you benefited particularly from the system of those loans themselves. So we value that particular in our extension. Proud to oppose.
I'd like to thank the previous speaker for a very faint speech. Quick check of that the panel is ready as well.
Yep, ready to go.
Then I'm very happy to call upon the member of government. Here.
How audible am I? Perfect. All right, 3, 2, 1. Opening opposition wants these countries to be good international citizens, to honour their commitments, to maintain their relationships, and so on. The problem is, if you can only ever repay the interest and their benefit is that you can accrue more debt later, the question becomes, to what end? They never give a conclusion to this. Presumably it's because what they want is ultimately to give you enough latitude to spend domestically again, do the social spending that we prize on our side. Maybe then that would be okay, except that in the meantime, opposition says nothing on the quality of those relationships they care so much about maintaining. In fact, they are often really abusive, and perpetuating that cycle to your own detriment in the hope of a long-run benefit, which is just the thing we deliver on our side quicker, is a perverse way for these governments to prioritize their obligations. So I will address 3 things in this extension. First, why growth is better. Second, why debt is often odious, and that is, does not trigger an obligation for you to prioritize the repayment of it. And third, these countries are often in a good position to renegotiate that debt, which allows many of our benefits to arise without many of opposition's harms. So a rebuttal will be integrated. Turning to the first question on why growth is a better policy for these governments in any situation. Often these countries are running a surplus, which that is apart from the interest they are paying on the debt. That's critical because they're not able to access the principle of that debt, which already defers a lot of opposition's benefits into the never never. But it means that if they did not have to prioritize that domestically, their budgets are actually in good shape. What does then the prioritization of repayment mean? It means prioritizing growth does indeed mean that other creditors will be less inclined to lend, but less access to international credit markets may be a good thing here because it would make this cycle that occurs on the negative side far less likely to continue. But in the shorter term, when you do prioritize the repayment at the cost of domestic spending, you are very likely, as we've told you already through POIs, to trigger a recession because you cannot support consumer demand while freezing pensions and reducing welfare and letting schools and hospitals decay. So when that recession does arrive, the problem is you have less tax revenue for you to continue servicing those obligations. That is why that prioritization is so necessary. Opening opposition asked, well, empirically, these countries have seemed to survive, haven't they, with less social spending? Well, we gave you the empirical example of Greece, which I suppose indeed survived. But the question is, do they have alternatives? If they had different levels of prioritization, would they have borne the brunt of that recession, which of course landed on the poor the hardest? But also that the poor are the critical ingredient in turning that cycle around because they are the ones with the least savings who tend to spend the most. They're what underpin demand in an economy that is trying to be saved from recession. So the prioritization of putting money into the hands of the poor, who are disproportionately the beneficiaries of this government spending, is the way to stimulate those economies and ensure that those recessions are far less likely. So that is why growth is the better policy in these situations. Second, the debt is often odious. That is to say, it is issued without the public's consent or any benefit to the public, and the creditor knows it. This is because most heavily indebted countries are victims of extractive regimes, leaders who've enriched themselves at the expense of the people they govern. Foreign money, either from special risky debt lenders or from superpowers like China or the United States, who care more about influence than balance sheets, that is earmarked for the government. The money that is earmarked for the government is appropriated into private bank accounts. Instability or corruption then spurs capital flight, which means the rich are stashing their assets offshore. Perversely, the rest of the world seems to owe Africa more than it owes external creditors. For every dollar of foreign inflow into the biggest African countries, 80 cents flows back out the door. What that means is that these countries are not the ones who are suffering because they're not being repaid, or these lenders who specialize in risky investments not suffering greatly because not being repaid. Often that was the design of those loans. This means first, the promise was bad. So when opening opposition makes arguments that the most important thing is to honor the promise that was made, it was not made in the kind of good faith that they're presuming when they make that argument. The second, the rewards of putting repayment first would flow to the rich at the cost of the poor, and that is an unjust arrangement morally for the countries to prioritize. But third, many of these creditors will be back because the relationships opening opposition is concerned with are not at risk because of the very reason that they gave those loans expecting and knowing full well that those were not made for the interest of the public. At this point, actually, really quickly, I'll finish the point and then take a POI. Prioritising social spending is the only moral action in that case. The money was borrowed on the people's behalf. The most urgent imperative is that they receive the benefits, not the people, the cronies who are governing them. But second, domestic reinvestment spurs the growth that is the only way to fulfill that obligation in the long run anyway. At that point, let me take a point of information from closing.
Okay, so your point on recession is just completely uncomparative, right? Because if it's true that we can only pay off the interest, not the principal, which is a complete assertion that you make, it's also then true then you're probably giving limited spending to social programs, right? Like presuming the money is the same, then like it's unclear why this point is actually falling to one side.
No, so the money that you receive from the people who are lending you the money are firstly investing in that country, not for reasons to expect repayment, which means they will keep giving that money to the country, even if you have not prioritized repayment, because they're interested in things apart from repayment. Let me expand on that in the point that's about to come. Finally, these countries are often in a good position to renegotiate. This is because these creditors are outside the mainstream of government bond buyers. They're using sophisticated financial instruments with fine attention to risk. If you are investing in a government that has a poor credit record, you are like not investing in government bonds, like you are a different kind of financial operator who has factored in the risk that you're occurring here. And that is why these countries are often willing to renegotiate with you and in a good position to do so. Also, the creditors are afraid of losing their initial investment when they purchase the bonds, far more than they are concerned about receiving the repayment later. So you can definitely renegotiate that. They'd rather not lose their investment altogether. But also, one thing those lenders are really afraid of is contagion. The idea that if you did default, then other countries would follow suit because of the cross-pollination of those debts. What that means is that these countries are very able to say, no, we will put our domestic spending first and repay you later. That's why renegotiation is the path forward. It does allow us to capture many of the benefits that opposition bench are attempting to claim in this debate. And that is why this is what we're proud to propose.
I'd like to thank the previous speaker for a very fine speech. Quick check that my panel is also ready.
Good.
Then I'm very happy to call upon the member of opposition. He.
So I think up and down the government bench, we get an assumption about what social programs are that are overly generous and assume that they're always going to have this massive positive impact on the economy, prevent recessions, when often it looks like, I don't know, Viktor Orban building a massive football stadium in his hometown of 1,000 people to enrich his cronies. I think the underlying assumption that this is always going to like save you from recession is kind of ridiculous. But moreover, we're going to like give many numerous extensions on your economic solvency that you get by proving that you're a viable financial actor on the international stage. So firstly, refutation to OG, and then our case, then refutation to CG. So firstly, I would say that opening government assumes that programs are always intrinsically economically beneficial, which the nature of these programs, even in the best case, isn't always the case. It's like paying for someone's life support is obviously a valuable thing, but probably not good for the economy because they're still comatose. But like, even if the stated goal would help the economy, if it were to like come true, economic like corruption and inefficiency undercuts the efficacy of these programs, meaning infrastructure might be nice, but if you triple pay so that you can give contracts to your cronies, then it probably isn't doing a very good deal of economic well-being compared to leaving it in the hands of taxpayers, for example. We would also say that, I don't know, lots of countries are probably not good at making like rational trade-offs about what is actually good for the economy for a number of reasons. So this looks like, for example, countries spending billions of dollars building like Olympic stadiums and infrastructure that never leads to any sort of economic payoff. The underlying structural reasons for why this case are numerous, and are things like, for example, the fact that politicians are short-termist in terms of their incentives, and when weighing will prioritize optics and present issues that can get them immediately reelected over long-term stability for their country, which they might be like, you know, out of office by the time it affects people. It's the fact that like large social spending on something that looks good but doesn't help the economy can be sufficient to get re-election and is easier, so it's often a go-to. It could also be the fact that people are generally, especially in democracies, but dictatorships as well, are short-termist in that if people are starving now, they're not in a position to weigh that against people, like twice as many people starving in the future, even if that is an obviously like morally worse harm, which means that they're unable to make decisions that are like in the best interest of the country, which generally leads to increased spending in a way that isn't necessarily economically viable in the long term. They also assume that the present economic position will last in a way that is often fallacious. So like, for example, oil-rich countries will spend as if that boom will last forever. So Venezuela, or literally even Alberta in Canada, will spend tons of money off of their oil wealth, where like, because they have it at the moment, and people think that the government is rich and are able to do it. And then as soon as the oil boom like drops, then they have no economic solvency, and all of their like pension fund is dried up and gone. I think having a form of forced savings that forces countries to put money away into debt repayments that makes them more financially solvent in the long term is probably comparatively better, given that the underlying economic constructives of the way these like programs are given out are not always actually in the best way to help the economy. We would also note that given that these programs exist on a spectrum from extremely economically effective to not very effective, given that we're prioritizing, not completely cutting all programs, probably just cutting the ones that are the most economically draining, maybe the ones that compete with private sectors and are actually like driving down the economy, et cetera. So onto our extension, right? I would say that we're going to provide a bunch of new mechanisms about economic solvency. So OO says that failure to pay off loans will make it hard in the future because you look bad in your creditors. We're going to extend on that. We would say that countries are often presently bound to IMF agreements or conditions on repayment that have built-in consequences for not paying them back, like explicit denial of future loans or the right to impose austerity measures themselves, which lead to the same net results, but give countries less choice as the conditions become enforced by external actors. So it means that future loans and bailouts that you inevitably need to prop up your welfare state because you have so little money that you can barely pay off the principal, as CG likes to tell you, means that as soon as you now need to pay off these loans somehow, you're kind of fucked, right? So it looks like, for example, Jamaica having a massive amount of debt in the 70s, and because they didn't have any reasonable credit, because of that massive debt that they weren't able to pay off and put money into, they were forced to turn to the IMF and impose crippling structural adjustment programs that look like a complete cutting of social services. The comparative here then is paying off debts early to allow you to make trade-offs and internally maintain sovereignty, because even if some programs are cut, making trade-offs early reduces cuts in the future and preserves your ability to make the trade-offs best for your country, as opposed to having them externally imposed by the only actors that are able to give you money. So secondly, we say that you give internal stability of your country financially. So financial solvency of countries and preventing inflation is often contingent on perceived fiscal responsibility. So countries that print tons of money while indebted to prop up their social programs and then don't have the underlying capital to justify those programs see massive currency inflations as a result of just like money printer go burr or whatever. And generally, it's not very good for the economy to see Venezuela or Greece. The net impact of this inflation and perceived instability of the economy is crippling. It drives up any interest in foreign direct investment that can make the economy successful or like directly build up infrastructure. All of the stuff that CG talks about like investing in a country because you want to like be economically tied to them is probably contingent on a vision of that country's future being economically prosperous to some extent. Which is contingent on believing that they won't have like mass inflation because they're printing programs, like money for programs that they can't afford. I would say that it makes basic financial transactions difficult, and it means that government savings like pension funds and social security savings can become worthless when the currency that is associated with those savings is like lacks value as governments print money that they don't have. We would say that when you when you aren't printing money for social programs randomly, you have forced savings via debt refinancing, which is probably better. We'd say that you are also able to get access to major trading blocks like the EU, which is often contingent on financial solvency, since dealing with countries that are financially insolvent and will require future bailouts is kind of undesirable, which means that you get access when you're able to demonstrate that you're willing to be financially solvent, even if it literally just means paying off the interest on a loan to show that you're willing to be like financially responsible in a way that signals that you're like a valuable like debtor to have. Means that one, you get access to trading blocks where you can get like future access to economic aid like more cheaply and easily, and it also means you get trading blocks that are beneficial to your economy. In terms of refutation to like closing government, firstly, I just want to respond to this odious debt point. It doesn't fucking matter whether or not it's like ethical for you to pay it back. The enforcement mechanisms that countries will apply upon you do not care whether or not the debt was legitimate, which is why Haiti continued to pay back like debt for like slaves free during their Haitian revolt to France, because they knew that France would impose crippling like restrictions on Haiti and that they wouldn't be able to get access to capital in the future, regardless of the odiousness of this debt. This point is completely irrelevant. I would also say that like even if it's the case, and like the assumption that you're only paying off the interest on the loan is just an assertion. Like it's no reason to believe it's true. I don't know. They just say it's the case. Who fucking knows? I don't know. But even if this is true, the marginal benefit you get to proving that you are a financially responsible actor, that you're just gonna like money printer go burr on all of your cash, still gets all sorts of marginal benefits in terms of proving your like solvency for future investments, reducing like the fear that your currency will be inflated, giving you better access to negotiate for things like better like loan forgiveness in the future because you're still seen as like moderately credible. We also have this idea that people just give you money no matter what. It's kind of ridiculous. Obviously, if you have finite capital, you'll prioritize giving it to the countries that will comparatively be more likely to pay that money back because you can get the same benefits but like less harms. And also the fact that you can impose restrictions is probably part of the political interest, which means not cooperating makes it unlikely you're ever going to get direct investment. I'm very proud to oppose.
I'd like to take the previous I think speech. Big checkup of my panel is also ready.
Cool. If you guys are good to go.
Yep, I'm ready.
Then I'm very happy to call on the government whip.
Fantastic. Just give me one moment. Cool. Okay. Starting in 3, 2, 1. I want to begin by directly responding to the extension that we just heard. The first, and there'll be 3 parts to this. The first is on the opposition's idea that this is a form of forced savings that comes in contrast to vanity projects by governments. The reasons that they provide you that these governments engage in these vanity projects is either that they are substantially corrupt, that they believe it will help them win re-election, or because of some other sort of nefarious means. The thing is that these incentives still point in the direction of them not really being the things that are being cut, right? Like we're describing a government in this context that is not behaving in a fiscally responsible manner. And what that means is that it is, although the opposition may wish to claim that they get to decide that, grandma's healthcare bill is still going to be covered, but the stadium won't. The government is currently acting on its deeply irrational economic basis because of, some sort of political calculation or wherever. And if we figure out where cuts need to go, the opposition needs to concede that at least a substantial amount, probably at least the same proportion of spending is still going to go to those types of things because the same incentives are going to be operating. And that means that a substantial number of these cuts are going to be on things that are monstrous in the way that Dan and indeed our opening explains to you that closing opposition has so far been entirely willing to bite the bullet on. I can't take a point of information from opening government. Secondly, on this point about these guys having the other thing that I'd say though, right, and this is quite basic, Dan tells you in extension that doing this will trigger a recession in the short term, or indeed will contribute to a recession. A good example like this is Greece, which has been running primary surpluses for 10 years, and yet nonetheless has been unable to pay off any of the principal on its debt. In fact, it's grown because they haven't been able to fully make the repayments on the servicing costs, so they needed to add it to the debt pile. In that kind of context, governments that are undergoing recessions are then most likely to engage in short-termist spending that leads to the sort of cash grabs that the opposition describes. So if that's what that's afraid of, it's going to get worse. Secondly, the opposition talks about economic solvency and their fear of things like structural readjustment programs and stuff like that. Well, the first observation to make about this is that it comes too late. We're talking about governments in this debate that are already substantially debt-ridden. That is to say, the amount of debt that they have is such that any good faith attempt at repayment will struggle. Like, obviously, the worst case countries in this debate, which are a substantial majority of the countries in the world, are countries that even if they attempt to run primary surpluses, struggle to pay down any of the principal of the debt. And in that context, the problems that the opposition describes are ones that have already arisen, right? So, for example, you're already going to be perceived to be in an extraordinarily difficult financial position because people understand that both the enormous amount of internal political instability that you've created by lowering people's quality of life and the fact that your ability to pay off these debts hovers on a knife edge. Oh, sorry, I cut out. Am I back on now? Have you been able to hear me the whole time, Chair? Great. Cool. I just got a message saying I cut out, but I assume that's maybe a them problem, not a me problem, or at least I hope it is. Yeah, as a consequence of those things, I think trivially in this debate, it means that they're already going to be perceived as extraordinarily risky. And so although the problem that the opposition is describing may get worse, it won't get that much worse. And it is already something that they're running into. The second thing to say about these things is that as Dan tells you, into the medium term, you're able to provide an alternative value statement to international creditors and participants in international trade blocks, because if you're able to accomplish the benefit of economic growth, which I'll demonstrate when I'm summarizing the extension, we're the only team that's actually made any attempt to demonstrate, they're then highly likely to treat you better. A good example for this is Iceland, a country that did in fact renege on a lot of its loans back in 2008, and then relatively quickly was able to achieve a period of economic growth. And after a while, like not even that long, like 2 to 3 years, it was essentially treated as an ordinary member of the global community. And that is because far more than any sort of indication, people look at the fundamentals. The fundamentals of this country indicates that there is a substantial risk that they're going to default. The fundamentals of the country that pursues our strategy, reconsolidates, ceases paying back all of its debt for a period of time, invests that money and takes the primary surpluses that they've been able to create, is a government that then subsequently will have the fundamentals that into the medium term, it's able to accomplish the things that the opposition is able to talk about. And the final thing that I want to rebut is a new response to the idea of perceived insolvency. And I want to just ding the harms they're attaching here, which is like the idea that you'll be able to access trading blocks. I guess the problem with this is obviously the suggestion that it hasn't happened so far. And so the odds of these things happening are in fact very low. I'll now take a point from opening opposition.
How do nations sustain social spending?
So nations have economies that generate, and then they sell goods and services internally and externally. Governments then tax those. The point of that tax, I know that sounds trivial, but it's kind of relevant when you say the problem is that a lot of that tax is currently getting eaten up in debt repayment and servicing costs, right? And a lot of that happens internally already, right? And won't be affected meaningfully by this, right? Like these countries are often not fueling any current spending on the basis of debt. They've incurred debt in the past and then subsequently they're incapable of paying it back, right? So we are not because if it is the case, as you suggest, that what they're in fact doing is paying for social services perpetually by engaging in debt financing, then that is a catastrophe because it means eventually they will literally be forced to go bankrupt, except there'll be tons more money and their economy will be structured around an assumption that they're able to take on more debt than they currently have, which obviously is a worse sort of scenario. I want to conclude by talking about how our extension cuts into the opening half, right? Both opening halves agree on the objectives, a long-term future in which a strong economy results in the capacity of the government to have social welfare programs and the provision of jobs and economic growth. Opening government thinks that that benefit is enough. Opening opposition's claim is that you require continued access to credit markets in order to achieve those things. And if you don't pay your debt, you'll lose access to those credit markets and it will face sanctions. The way that we won that and the way that we accomplished the largest possible benefit in this debate was asking a couple of questions about the nature of that debt that so far have not been rebutted. The first question we asked is, what kind of debt is it? We explained that a lot of this debt is odious. Closing opposition believes that that doesn't morally matter. And that is, of course, plausible, I suppose, if you are in fact as harsh as closing opposition. But the problem is that given the nature of this debt as being substantially odious, it does mean that a huge number of international creditors wouldn't hold it against you nearly as much as opposed to legitimate forms of debt, because they understand that it was debt that was entered into dishonestly. And as a result, it doesn't meet the usual standards that we apply to contracts, which means people will think of it differently. Secondly, can these countries ever pay the debt back? We explained they can't, which means you need to try something new because the alternative is being perpetually stuck in this position. Thirdly, do they need more debt? We bite the bullet and talk about the circumstances in which you're totally cut off from international debt bond markets. And we explain that being cut off from debt in the short term is good because these countries that are often running primary surpluses, or at least very close to, are then able to live within their means and exclusively invest internally. And finally, will these countries actually be cut off? We explain the kind of junk bond investors that are now trading in highly indebted countries are actually very well placed and highly likely to be willing to renegotiate, which means that harm won't even occur. We are the team that creates a path to future financial stability, and that is why we are happy to propose.
I'd like to thank the previous speaker for a very fine speech. Quick check of that my panel is also ready.
I'm ready.
And I'm very happy to call upon the opposition whip to conclude the opposition side and the debate as a whole. Here, here.
Okay, I'll start. Okay, so panel, I think at the end of this debate, the government bench has largely asserted the fact that spending money on social programs is going to somehow, quote unquote, uplift the economy without neither opening gov nor closing gov taking on the burden of actually proving how this is going to go about, right? Especially noting the response we got to our extension on the ways in which social programs, governments often spend money on social programs, which is that they have a lot of money put into vanity projects. And I will respond more to this response, but I think I'd like to flag that the response we got from the whip speaker was that they're still going to spend money on vanity programs, assumes that there's some inefficiency in the ways in which governments spend money on social programs. And it would have been nice for one gov speaker, a singular one, to ever try and prove to us why these social programs are likely to be effective and are actually going to help uplift your economy economy in the long term. I think given that, it was a failure on the part of the gov bench to not respond to like one of the largest parts of our extension, which is that firstly, like even in a world in which you potentially could or could not pay back loans or could not pay back social programs, the harm of like defaulting on your loans and looking like you are a nation that is unable to pay it back, even if like all you're doing is paying back interest, still makes you look like a more honorable country and is going to decrease the risk of having inflation in the future. It's going to make your currency look stronger. It's going to make you more open to having investment into your nation. It's going to give you the upper hand in future trading negotiations. It will give you the ability to take on more loans in the future and the ability to the ability to not be like debt trapped permanently. All of that probably should have warranted some type of response from the gov team and probably going to weigh it into us winning the round. I'm going to largely clash with the gov bench on three things. Okay, the first question I want to ask, and then I'll weigh out over OO, although I'll just flag briefly that I think in general, weighing our case with like opening op, generally I think opening op correctly identifies the fact that there is a failure in the ways in which like what happens when countries like default on their loans, and they identify that like you probably want to open yourself up to money in the future, but they don't actually get to the like critical impacts of what happens what happens at the point at which you default, which are like all the things Jacob talked to you about, like having a strong currency, not having inflation, having the ability to open up with trading blocks. I'll impact that more later. Okay, first question then, does spending money on social programs work, or which social programs are you going to be spending on? So like I will note that like the response we got to part of our extension, which was on the idea that governments often mismanage their ability to spend on social programs, was that governments are going to keep spending on these vanity projects, and we can't guarantee that they're going to cut the ones that are maximally inefficient. I'll respond to this in a few ways. The first thing I will say is that you can be a government that is irresponsible, but still cut the programs that are comparatively like more unpopular than popular programs, right? So programs that have a lot of like popular will, programs that government bench is implementing that like, you know, benefit people via like, I don't know, like healthcare or whatever, or education, are presumably going to be more popular than like getting a large football field, because like, you know, if people are lacking in funds, they probably want the thing that helps them the most, which means that if you are a leader, irresponsible with the way that you spend, we think in a world where you're going to cut something, you're probably not going to cut the one that's maximally like popular to your citizens to appeal to them. But the second thing I'll say is, even if you don't buy that governments are going to cut the ones that are like most unpopular first, we'll take on the burden of saying that perhaps they spend inefficiently, but that just means in gov world where you prioritize spending on social programs, they are also spending on these inefficient programs, and they never tell us why they're ever going to spend on ones that aren't inefficient, right? Like if you buy into anything GovWhip says in response here, which is that they're still going to spend on vanity projects, that means that the entire gov team is prioritizing the spending on these vanity projects still in their world without ever having like the debt refinancing or like other benefits to better programs, right? So it still means that they have to take on that burden and they can't weigh out on that clash. The second thing I want to respond to here is in terms of like opening government. So like the big push from opening government was this idea that if you spend on social programs, it will like quote unquote help the economy, which is firstly like not a mechanism for actually benefiting the economy. Just saying like spending money does not equal like economic success, right? But like let's say for a second that they actually did this. Three responses. The first is that I think we tell you that like largely inefficiency and corruption undercuts the benefits they have. So even if it might marginally help the economy, we think a lot of those can be undercut by the ways in which governments go about doing this. Why then does this weigh to our side? Firstly, we tell you that the economy is going to get substantially worse at the point at which to keep financing your social programs, when you've defaulted on your loans and can no longer get like maximally as much money, you're going to do things like print out a lot of money and lead to like massive like rampant inflation, right? So in terms of helping the economy, I'd say that inflation can often be far worse. Why is that the case? Because first, it makes your country look a lot riskier for future investors, which means that it's a lot harder for you to get like foreign direct investment to like keep spending keep spending on these like financing programs. Secondly, we'd say at the point at which your economy is like crumbling and you just keep printing out money, it makes it really hard for you to enter trading blocks. The response we got was, it hasn't happened yet and you haven't joined a trading block yet. Like panel, in the future there can be more trading blocks you can enter. Maybe you haven't entered yet because you're in debt and don't have like the necessary preconditioned money to enter, i.e. like the EU, for example, requires that countries have a certain amount of money supply in order to enter, right? So all of these economic harms will outweigh the marginal benefit that you get from GovBench on the economy that is also undercut by their own logic. Okay, second thing I want to talk about is like largely economic growth and recession. So OG and CG largely talk about here like austerity measures and recession that's going to be put in place. I have like a few responses to this. The first thing I'll say is that like in response to a POI I gave where I asked them why it is that on our side we have to spend like a ton of money and on their side they don't have to spend a ton of money, they said it's because countries are going to keep paying you back money so they don't actually have to take on the burden on GovBench of having a trade-off. So in terms of this ridiculous argument we get that like they're going to negotiate with you regardless, I say, yeah, that's probably true, right? They will negotiate with you regardless. But here's the actual harm in that is at the point at which you negotiate, you turn to like you get the worst end of the deal, right? So as like Jacob tells you an extension that went unresponded to when like the government flippantly responded to our case was that you now are like Jamaica, for example, who has to turn to the IMF, who gives you like conditions that will like actually like cripple your economy because they force you to slash all your public programs in order to keep doing it. And dictators and like governments who are financially like insolvent are going to take on more debt at the harm of like citizens in your country in the future who are now forced to finance that debt long term. So yes, CG is right that you will get negotiations, but those negotiations will be worse for you when you don't have any negotiating power because you've lost all of your credibility. That's why they lose out there. The second thing in terms of like austerity and recession is at the point at which they tell us that we are only allowed to spend as much money as it pays off the interest, I'd say the amount of money they have to stop their recession is very low and self-mitigates. So they might just have a long-term recession. It's unclear that they actually solve for that. The third thing I'd say on recessions here is because we're able to prove to you on CO that we're more able, and this one unresponded to, that we're more able to get things like foreign direct investment at the point at which your currency looks stronger. We're better able to have like pension plans and like economic solvency and your currency is stable and you lack like inflation. It means you're able to undercut what will lead to a potential recession in the future. So we actually break through that in the first place and help your economy. So at the end of the debate there on CO, we like vastly benefit your country's economy in the long term. On this question of like moral responsibility to pay back loans, we think this is like ridiculous because like you just get like oops, I'm out of time. Okay, sorry, pause.
I'd like to thank all the speakers for a very interesting debate. I would ask now if the tab team can stop the live streaming so we can do our panel discussion, or alternatively, do we get a breakout room for panel discussion actually, because now we are in the main session?